Picture this. A pregnant woman sits in a lawyer's office, about to sign divorce papers that will leave her with almost nothing. Her billionaire tech mogul husband thinks he's won the ultimate victory. But what he doesn't know is that she's carrying more than just his child. She's carrying a secret that will destroy everything he's built. This isn't just another story about a messy divorce. This is the story of Madison Carter Blackwood, a woman who discovered that her entire marriage was a lie, her therapist was a spy, and her father-in-law had left her something that would make her one of the most powerful people in America. But power comes with a price. When Madison tries to claim what's rightfully hers, she finds herself fighting not just one man, but an entire network of corrupt judges, crooked lawyers, and deadly conspirators who will stop at nothing to silence her forever. What happens when an FBI agent receives a desperate call from a hospital cleaning lady? What's hidden in a childhood music box that could topple a $4 billion empire? And how does a woman with nothing left to lose become the most dangerous person in the room? You're about to hear a story that will make you question everything you think you know about power, justice, and the lengths people will go to protect their secrets. This is On Divorce Day, Millionaire's Pregnant Wife Arrives with Secret Will. And trust me, you've never heard anything like this before. The mahogany conference table in the law offices of Sterling, Hayes, and Associates stretched before Madison Carter Blackwood like a battlefield where her life would be decided. At 7 months pregnant, she shifted uncomfortably in the oversized leather chair, her hands instinctively moving to rest protectively over her swollen belly. The October wind rattled the 42nd floor windows of the Manhattan skyscraper, and Madison couldn't shake the feeling that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one brewing in this sterile conference room. The divorce papers lay scattered across the polished surface like fallen leaves, each page representing another nail in the coffin of her 3-year marriage to Jackson Blackwood III. Her prenuptial agreement, all 67 pages of it, sat in a neat stack beside her elbow. She had signed it in a haze of wedding bliss, trusting the man she loved when he said it was just a formality that would never matter. Now those pages felt like a noose around her neck, choking off any hope of financial independence. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the minutes until Jackson's arrival. Madison's lawyer, Robert Davies, a tired-looking man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, shuffled through his own papers with the resigned air of someone who knew he was outgunned. Davies had been recommended by her college roommate as someone who fought for the underdog, but Madison could see in his nervous movements that even he was intimidated by the legal firepower Jackson would bring to bear. "Mrs. Blackwood," Davies said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want to go over the settlement terms one more time before they arrive. According to the prenuptial agreement, you're entitled to a lump sum payment of $2 million. That's it. No alimony, no claim to Blackwood Industries stock, no marital property rights to the penthouse or the Hampton estate. $2 million. It sounded like a fortune to most people, but Madison had learned enough about New York real estate prices and the cost of raising a child to know it wouldn't last long. After taxes and legal fees, she'd be lucky to walk away with $1.5 million. Enough to rent a modest apartment and live carefully for maybe 5 years if she was frugal. After that, she'd be on her own with a child to support in a 3-year gap in her resume that made her virtually unemployable in her former field of investment banking. "What about the child?" Madison asked, though she dreaded the answer. Davies looked even more uncomfortable. The prenup includes a morality clause that essentially states if the marriage ends due to your conduct, Jackson retains primary custody. His legal team has prepared documentation suggesting that your decision to continue the pregnancy against his wishes constitutes abandonment of your marital duties. Madison felt sick. She remembered the night she had told Jackson about the pregnancy 6 months ago. They had been in their penthouse overlooking Central Park, sharing what she thought would be a romantic dinner. She had planned the announcement carefully, even buying a tiny pair of baby shoes to surprise him. Instead of joy, Jackson's face had gone cold with fury. "You did this on purpose," he had said, his voice deadly calm. "You're trying to trap me. Jackson, we talked about having children. You said you wanted a family. I said I might want children someday. I never said I wanted them with you." The cruelty in his voice had been like a physical blow. "Get rid of it." When Madison refused, Jackson had moved her out of their shared bedroom that very night. For 6 months, she had lived like a ghost in her own home, watching her husband parade a succession of younger women through their lives, while she grew rounder and more isolated. The final humiliation had come 2 weeks ago, when Jackson's 23-year-old assistant Amber had moved into the master bedroom while Madison was relegated to the guest quarters. The heavy oak doors of the conference room swung open with a soft whisper of expensive hinges, and Jackson Blackwood III made his entrance. At 45, he was still devastatingly handsome in the way that only came from good genes and unlimited money. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled. His custom-tailored Italian suit fitted him like a second skin, and his smile carried the cold confidence of a man who had never lost a single battle in his entire privileged life. Behind him came his legal army, 3 attorneys from Whitman, Cross and Partners, the most prestigious and ruthless law firm in the city. Madison recognized the lead attorney immediately, Victoria Blackwood, Jackson's own sister. Victoria was a striking woman in her early 40s, with sharp cheekbones and predatory intelligence in her dark eyes. She had built her reputation destroying opposing parties in high-stakes divorces, and Madison knew she would show no mercy to a sister-in-law she had never liked. "Madison, darling," Jackson said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescending affection that had once made her feel cherished but now made her skin crawl. "You look absolutely radiant. Pregnancy certainly suits you." He settled into the chair at the head of the table, with the fluid grace of a man taking his rightful throne. "I do hope we can keep this civilized. After all, we're about to be co-parents." Victoria Blackwood opened her briefcase with surgical precision and began arranging documents on the table like a general deploying troops. "Let's get straight to business," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "The terms of the prenuptial agreement are quite clear. Mrs. Blackwood is entitled to a settlement of $2 million, to be paid within 30 days of the finalization of the divorce. $2 million is extremely generous," added Marcus Webb, another member of Jackson's legal team. Webb was a thin man with pale eyes and the hungry look of a shark sensing blood in the water. Considering Mrs. Blackwood's limited contribution to the marriage and the brevity of the union, most courts would consider this settlement more than adequate. Limited contribution. The phrase hit Madison like a slap. For 3 years, she had given up her career, her independence, her identity to be the perfect corporate wife. She had attended countless dinner parties and charity galas, smiling and making small talk with Jackson's business associates. She had supervised the decoration of their homes, managed their social calendar, and played the role of gracious hostess whenever Jackson needed to impress clients or investors. She had been his arm candy, his domestic manager, his emotional support system, but none of that counted as contribution in the eyes of the law. "What about custody arrangements?" Davies asked, though Madison could hear the defeat in his voice. Jackson leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in a gesture Madison had once found attractive, but now recognized as deeply condescending. "I think what's best for the child is stability and security. Blackwood Industries is worth approximately $4 billion. I can provide opportunities and advantages that, frankly, Madison cannot." "I'm the child's mother," Madison said, finding her voice for the first time since Jackson's arrival. "Of course you are, darling, and you'll always have a place in our child's life." Jackson's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "But let's be practical. You'll be living in some cramped apartment in Queens, struggling to make ends meet. I can offer private schools, the finest medical care, travel opportunities, connections that will open doors throughout our child's life. Which environment do you really think is better for a Blackwood heir?" Victoria slid another document across the table. "This custody agreement provides for generous visitation rights, every other weekend, alternating holidays, and 4 weeks during the summer. Very reasonable terms." Madison stared at the document, the legal language blurring through her tears. Every other weekend. She would become a part-time mother to her own child, relegated to brief visits while Jackson raised their baby in the world of wealth and privilege that had once been hers. Her phone buzzed against the table, startling everyone in the room. A text message from an unknown number. "Your father-in-law left you more than you know. Check the safety deposit box. Key is in the music box." Madison frowned at the message, her heart skipping a beat. Thomas Blackwood Sr. had died 2 years ago in what everyone said was a peaceful death in his sleep. The reading of his will had been straightforward. Everything went to Jackson, his only son. There had been no mention of safety deposit boxes or hidden keys. This had to be some kind of spam or wrong number. Problem? Jackson asked, his sharp eyes noting her distraction. No, Madison said quickly, deleting the message. Just spam. But as she looked up from her phone, she caught Jackson's expression in the split second before he composed his features. There had been something there, a flicker of concern, maybe even fear. It was gone so quickly she might have imagined it, but it planted a seed of curiosity in her mind. Well then, Victoria said briskly, pulling out an elegant Mont Blanc pen and placing it beside the divorce papers. Shall we proceed? Mrs. Blackwood, if you'll just sign here, here, and here, we can have this matter concluded within the hour. Madison stared at the pen as if it were a loaded weapon. Once she signed those papers, it would all be over. Her marriage, her claim to the Blackwood fortune, her hope of providing her child with the life she had dreamed of. She would walk out of this room with nothing but a check in the clothes on her back, while Jackson continued his reign as the undisputed king of Silicon Valley. The grandfather clock chimed 3 times, marking the hour. Outside, the October storm was intensifying, rain lashing against the windows with increasing fury. Madison felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, and everyone in the room was waiting for her to jump. She picked up the pen, her hand trembling slightly. I need a moment, she said. Of course, Jackson replied, though his impatience was barely concealed. Take all the time you need, but I do have a board meeting at 4:30, so perhaps we could wrap this up soon? Madison closed her eyes and tried to think. Somewhere in the back of her mind, that mysterious text message nagged at her. Thomas Blackwood Sr. had always been kind to her during the brief time she had known him. Unlike his son, the elder Blackwood had possessed genuine warmth and integrity. He had built Blackwood Industries from nothing, turning a small software company into a tech empire through hard work and ethical business practices. Madison had often wondered what he would think of what his son had become. When she opened her eyes, Jackson was watching her with barely concealed irritation. Victoria was checking her watch. The other lawyers were shuffling papers with the restless energy of predators eager to finish their kill. Only Robert Davies looked at her with something approaching sympathy. Madison signed the papers with firm, steady strokes, each signature feeling like a small death. When it was finished, Victoria gathered the documents with obvious satisfaction. Congratulations, Victoria said, her smile sharp as a blade. You're officially free to start your new life. Free. The word tasted like ashes in Madison's mouth. Free to struggle as a single mother. Free to watch her child grow up in Jackson's world while she remained forever on the outside. Free to live with the knowledge that she had given up everything for a man who had never truly loved her. As she gathered her purse and prepared to leave, Madison noticed Jackson watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was triumph there, certainly, but also something else, something calculating and cold that made her skin crawl. For just a moment, she had the unsettling feeling that this divorce wasn't an ending for Jackson. It was the beginning of something else entirely. The mysterious text message about the safety deposit box echoed in her mind as she walked toward the door. It was probably nothing, just a cruel prank or a case of mistaken identity. But as Madison stepped out into the storm, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, Thomas Blackwood Sr. had left her a lifeline she hadn't discovered yet. 3 days after signing the divorce papers, Madison sat in the cramped studio apartment she had rented in Astoria, Queens, staring at the stack of bills and legal documents that represented her new reality. The apartment was a far cry from the Central Park penthouse she had called home for 3 years. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television through the bathroom wall, and the October wind rattled the single-pane windows with every gust. But it was hers, paid for with her own money, and for the first time in years, Madison felt like she could breathe freely. Her settlement check had arrived that morning, along with a terse note from Victoria Blackwood's office, reminding her that according to the terms of their agreement, she was prohibited from making any public statements about her marriage or the divorce proceedings. The non-disclosure clause in her prenup was ironclad. One word to the press about Jackson's affairs, his business practices, or his treatment of her would result in immediate forfeiture of her settlement and potential criminal charges for breach of contract. Madison had spent the morning calculating and recalculating her finances. After taxes, legal fees, and the security deposit on her new apartment, she had approximately $1.4 million left. It sounded like a fortune, but when she factored in the cost of raising a child in New York City, daycare, medical expenses, education, housing, the money would last perhaps 6 years if she was extremely careful. After that, she would need to find work. But who would hire a woman who had been out of the workforce for 3 years and whose former employer would undoubtedly give her a devastating reference? Her phone rang, interrupting her gloomy calculations. The caller ID showed Dr. Sarah Collins, the therapist Madison had been seeing for the past 8 months, to deal with her anxiety about the pregnancy and her crumbling marriage. "Madison, I need to see you immediately," Dr. Collins said, her usually calm voice tight with an urgency that sent alarm bells ringing in Madison's head. "Can you come to my office this afternoon? It's important. Is everything okay? I'd rather discuss this in person. How soon can you be here?" An hour later, Madison sat in the familiar beige office where she had spent countless sessions working through her fears about motherhood and marriage. Dr. Collins looked pale and shaken. Her normally perfect composure cracked like a broken mask. Her hands trembled as she poured water from a crystal pitcher, and she avoided making eye contact with Madison. "I have to tell you something that's going to be very difficult to hear," Dr. Collins began, setting down her water glass with a slight clink. "I discovered yesterday that our sessions have been compromised. Someone has been recording our conversations." The words hit Madison like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. "What do you mean, recorded?" "I found surveillance equipment in my office yesterday evening. Professional-grade devices, expertly hidden. They've been there for months, maybe since you first started coming to see me." Dr. Collins finally met Madison's eyes, and the guilt there was unmistakable. "Everything we've discussed, your fears about the pregnancy, your concerns about being a good mother, your doubts about your marriage, it's all been captured." Madison's mind raced back through every vulnerable moment she had shared in this room. Her admission that she sometimes felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of bringing a child into the world. Her fears about postpartum depression. Her confession that there were nights when she lay awake wondering if she would be a terrible mother like her own had been. Her private thoughts about Jackson's increasing coldness and cruelty. "He's going to use it against me," Madison whispered, the full implications hitting her like a freight train. "In a custody battle, he'll take those recordings and make me sound like an unfit mother." Dr. Collins nodded miserably. "I've already reported this to the state licensing board and the police. But Madison, you need to understand, your ex-husband has resources and connections that most people can only dream of. If he wants to use this information against you, he'll make it happen." Madison finished the sentence, feeling the familiar weight of Jackson's power pressing down on her. Even divorced, even supposedly free of him, he still controlled her life through his money and influence. "I'm so sorry," Dr. Collins said, and the tears in her eyes appeared genuine. "I feel like I've betrayed your trust, even though I had no idea this was happening." Madison left Dr. Collins' office in a daze, her mind struggling to process this new violation. Jackson hadn't been content to simply divorce her and take their child. He had been systematically building a case to destroy her credibility and fitness as a mother. Every moment of vulnerability, every private fear she had shared in therapy, had become ammunition in his war against her. She was walking aimlessly through Midtown Manhattan, lost in her thoughts, when someone called her name. Madison turned to see Elena Rodriguez, her former colleague from her investment banking days at Morrison Sterling. Elena looked nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder as if she expected to be followed. "Madison, thank God I found you," Elena said, hurrying over with obvious relief. "I've been trying to reach you for weeks, but all my calls went to voicemail." Madison realized that Jackson had probably been screening her calls during the divorce proceedings, another small control she hadn't even noticed. "Elena, what are you doing here?" "Looking for you. We need to talk, but not here. Too many eyes and ears." Elena glanced around the crowded street with obvious paranoia. "There's a coffee shop on 42nd Street, near the library. Meet me there in 20 minutes. And Madison, don't tell anyone where you're going. The coffee shop was a cramped, anonymous place filled with the usual mix of tourists and office workers grabbing their afternoon caffeine fix. Elena had chosen a table in the back corner, as far from the windows as possible. When Madison joined her, Elena immediately slid a manila envelope across the small table. I work for Meridian Tech now, Elena said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hiss of the espresso machine. We've been conducting due diligence on Blackwood Industries for a potential acquisition. What we found, she shook her head in disbelief. Madison, your ex-husband is running an operation that makes the NSA look like amateur hour. Madison opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside were photographs of computer screens, financial documents covered in highlighting and handwritten notes, and technical specifications that meant nothing to her, but looked ominous in their complexity. This is a surveillance network that spans multiple companies and government agencies, Elena explained, pointing to a flowchart that looked like something out of a spy thriller. Jackson has been collecting data on competitors, board members, politicians, judges, anyone who might be useful to him or who might pose a threat. That's illegal, Madison said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew how naive they sounded. Completely. Industrial espionage, privacy violations, wire fraud, probably RICO charges if the FBI ever gets their hands on this evidence. Elena leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. Madison, he's been watching you too. Not just the therapy sessions, everything. Your phone calls, your emails, your credit card purchases. He knows where you live now, what you've been buying, who you've been talking to. Madison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. The idea that Jackson had been monitoring her every move, even after their divorce, was both terrifying and somehow unsurprising. It was exactly the kind of systematic control he had always exercised, just taken to its logical extreme. Why are you telling me this? Madison asked. Because I remember what you were like at Morrison Sterling. You were one of the sharpest analysts I ever worked with, and you had more integrity in your little finger than most of the partners had in their entire bodies. When I heard about your divorce, I knew Jackson must have done something to destroy you, because the Madison Carter I knew would never have given up without a fight. Elena pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a major law firm. With this evidence, we can destroy him. Not just embarrass him or cost him money. We can send him to federal prison for the rest of his life. For the first time in months, Madison felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. Maybe she wasn't as powerless as Jackson wanted her to believe. Maybe there was still a way to fight back. What do we do? She asked. First, we take this to the FBI. I have a contact there, someone I trust. Then we go public, carefully through proper channels. But we make sure the whole world knows what kind of man Jackson Blackwood really is. Madison nodded, feeling something that might have been courage beginning to grow inside her. Let's do it. But as they left the coffee shop, neither woman noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street since they arrived, or the telephoto lens that had been capturing their every movement. Jackson Blackwood had not built his empire by leaving anything to chance, and he had certainly not achieved his current level of power by allowing his enemies to plot against him unmolested. By the time Madison returned to her apartment that evening, the wheels of Jackson's counterattack were already in motion. And this time, he would not be content with simply winning. He intended to destroy Elena Rodriguez so completely that no one would ever dare to stand against him again. Madison woke the next morning to her phone ringing incessantly. The caller ID showed Elena's number, but when she answered, the voice on the other end was barely recognizable as her former colleague. Elena sounded panicked, exhausted, and on the verge of complete breakdown. Madison, thank God you answered, Elena said, her words coming in a rush. I'm calling from jail. They arrested me at 5 this morning. Corporate espionage, theft of proprietary information, violation of federal computer crime statutes. They're talking about 15 to 20 years in prison. Madison felt the blood drain from her face. That's impossible. You were investigating them legally. You had every right to examine their business practices for the acquisition. The evidence disappeared, Elena said, her voice cracking with desperation. All of it. The files I showed you, the surveillance network documentation, the proof of Jackson's illegal activities. It's all gone. But somehow, Somehow they have evidence that I accessed Blackwood Industries servers illegally, that I downloaded proprietary source code, that I was selling trade secrets to foreign competitors. Madison could hear the sounds of a jail facility in the background. Metal doors clanging, guards shouting orders, the general cacophony of the legal system grinding its gears. The realization that her friend was actually behind bars, facing decades in prison for trying to help her, made Madison feel physically sick. Elena, this is insane. We'll fight this. We'll get you the best lawyer. With what money? Elena laughed bitterly. They've frozen all my accounts as proceeds of criminal activity. My house is being seized. My car was impounded. Madison, in the space of 12 hours, Jackson Blackwood has turned me from a successful tech executive into a penniless federal prisoner. The line went quiet for a moment except for the background noise of the jail. When Elena spoke again, her voice was deadly serious. Madison, listen to me very carefully. Don't trust anyone. Don't go to the FBI. Jackson has people there. Don't go to the media. He owns half the journalists in this city. And whatever you do, don't let him know that you're aware of the surveillance network. If he realizes what I told you, you'll end up worse than me. The call ended abruptly, leaving Madison staring at her phone in shock and growing terror. Elena's warnings echoed in her head as she realized the true scope of Jackson's power. He hadn't just framed Elena for corporate espionage, he had done it so quickly and efficiently that it suggested he had been prepared for this exact scenario. How many other people had crossed Jackson Blackwood and found themselves destroyed by carefully orchestrated evidence of crimes they had never committed? Madison spent the morning pacing her small apartment, trying to process what had happened and figure out her next move. The evidence Elena had shown her was gone, but Madison still had her own knowledge of Jackson's surveillance activities. The question was what to do with that information when her former ally was sitting in federal lockup and every official channel seemed to be compromised. Around noon, there was a knock at her door. Madison peered through the peephole and saw Victoria Blackwood standing in the hallway, looking perfectly composed despite having just destroyed a woman's life before breakfast. Victoria was dressed in an expensive charcoal suit and carried her omnipresent leather briefcase, looking like a corporate executioner making a house call. "May I come in?" Victoria asked when Madison reluctantly opened the door. "I think we need to have a conversation about your friend Elena Rodriguez and some very poor decisions that seem to be running in your social circle." Madison had no choice but to let her former sister-in-law into the apartment. Victoria looked around the modest space with barely concealed disdain, her expression suggesting she was touring a prison cell rather than a home. "Charming," Victoria said, settling onto Madison's second-hand couch as if she were doing Madison an enormous favor. "I can see why you chose this particular neighborhood. Very authentic. What do you want, Victoria?" "I want to help you avoid making the same mistakes as Miss Rodriguez." Victoria opened her briefcase with surgical precision and pulled out a thick file folder. "Elena Rodriguez was a foolish woman who thought she could take on Jackson Blackwood and win. The result, as you've no doubt heard, is that she'll be spending the next 2 decades in federal prison." Victoria opened the folder and spread several photographs across Madison's coffee table. They were surveillance photos of Madison and Elena meeting at the coffee shop, clear enough to identify both women and obviously taken with professional equipment. "Jackson is not a vindictive man," Victoria continued, her voice carrying the tone of someone discussing the weather. "He takes no pleasure in destroying people's lives. But he is a businessman who understands that disloyalty and betrayal must have consequences. Elena Rodriguez chose to steal from Blackwood Industries and attempted to recruit you as an accomplice. The fact that you didn't report her criminal behavior to the authorities could be seen as conspiracy." Madison stared at the photographs, understanding with growing horror that Jackson had been watching her every move even before Elena had approached her. He had known about their meeting, had probably orchestrated Elena's downfall before the coffee shop conversation had even ended. "But Jackson is prepared to be merciful," Victoria continued, pulling another document from her folder. "This is an affidavit stating that Elena Rodriguez approached you with stolen information and that you immediately rebuffed her criminal advances. Sign this, and any potential legal complications will disappear." Madison picked up the affidavit and read through the legal language. It painted Elena as a criminal mastermind who had tried to recruit Madison as an accomplice in corporate espionage. By signing it, Madison would be saving herself from prosecution, but condemning Elena to an even longer prison sentence. "I won't sign this," Madison said, pushing the document back across the table. Victoria's smile didn't waver, but something cold and dangerous flickered in her eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that, actually. It makes the next part of our conversation so much easier." She pulled out another file, this one much thicker than the first. "Madison, you're making a fundamental error in judgment. You seem to think that Jackson's interest in you ended with your divorce, but you're carrying his child, which makes you a Blackwood family matter in perpetuity." Victoria opened the new file and pulled out what appeared to be a medical report. The letterhead showed it was from Madison's obstetrician, Dr. Patricia Hernandez, and it was dated just 3 days ago. "This is the report from your last prenatal appointment," Victoria said, sliding the document across the table. "I'm afraid the news isn't good." Madison grabbed the report and began reading, her heart pounding as she scanned the medical terminology. According to the document, her baby showed markers for severe intellectual disabilities, spina bifida, and a host of other developmental abnormalities. The prognosis section recommended immediate termination of the pregnancy due to the severity of the defects. "This is fake," Madison said, but her voice lacked conviction. The document looked completely authentic, complete with Dr. Hernandez's signature and the hospital's official seal. "Is it?" Victoria asked, raising an eyebrow. "Doctors run hundreds of tests on pregnant women, many of which the patients aren't even aware of. Genetic screenings, blood work, ultrasound analyses. There's so much data that sometimes significant abnormalities don't come to light until much later in the pregnancy." Madison's hands shook as she held the report. She knew it had to be fake, but it was so expertly crafted, so detailed and official-looking, that a part of her mind began to wonder if there was any truth to it. What if her baby really did have serious health problems? What if she had been so focused on her battle with Jackson that she had missed important medical information? "Of course Jackson is prepared to take full responsibility for the child's care," Victoria continued, her voice taking on a tone of false sympathy. "Raising a severely disabled child is enormously expensive and emotionally draining. The best facilities, the finest specialists, experimental treatments. We're talking about millions of dollars in medical costs over the child's lifetime." Victoria pulled out yet another document from her seemingly inexhaustible briefcase. "This custody agreement reflects the medical realities. Jackson will take full legal and physical custody upon the child's birth. You'll be free to visit, of course, but the day-to-day care will be handled by qualified professionals." Madison stared at the custody papers, feeling the walls of Jackson's trap closing around her. Even if she knew the medical report was fake, how could she prove it in court? Jackson undoubtedly had doctors, medical experts, and specialists who would testify to whatever version of reality served his purposes. "I need time to think about this," Madison said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Victoria replied, standing and smoothing her skirt. "But don't take too long. Jackson's patience has limits, and he's already been more generous than most men would be in his position." As Victoria gathered her papers and prepared to leave, she paused at the door and turned back to Madison with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Oh, and Madison, I wouldn't recommend trying to verify that medical report with Dr. Hernandez. She's been called away on a family emergency and won't be available for several weeks. Something about a sick relative in Argentina. But I'm sure you understand how these things go." After Victoria left, Madison sat alone in her apartment, staring at the fake medical report and feeling more trapped than she had ever felt in her life. Elena was in prison, Dr. Hernandez had conveniently disappeared, and Jackson was systematically eliminating every potential ally and avenue of escape. But as she sat there in despair, Madison remembered the mysterious text message she had received during the divorce proceedings, the one about Thomas Blackwood Sr. in the safety deposit box. It was probably nothing, a wrong number or a cruel prank. But at this point, Madison had nothing left to lose by investigating. She looked around her apartment until she found the music box that had belonged to her grandmother. She had carried it with her from college through her career and marriage, a small piece of her past that Jackson had never shown interest in controlling. For the first time in years, Madison really examined the delicate wooden box, looking for anything unusual. The music box played Fur Elise when wound, and inside the velvet-lined compartment, Madison had always kept a few pieces of costume jewelry. But now, running her fingers along the edges of the velvet lining, she felt something she had never noticed before. The lining in one corner was slightly raised, as if something was hidden underneath. Madison carefully peeled back the velvet and found a small brass key taped to the wooden bottom of the box. Attached to the key was a folded piece of paper with an address written in careful handwriting. First National Bank, 855th Avenue, Safety Deposit Box 479. Madison stared at the key and address, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Someone had hidden this key in her music box probably years ago, and she had carried it with her unknowingly through all the turmoil of her marriage and divorce. But who had put it there, and what was in the safety deposit box? There was only one way to find out. The First National Bank building stood like a fortress of glass and steel on Fifth Avenue, its imposing facade designed to convey both prosperity and security to the wealthy clients who entrusted their valuables to its vaults. Madison stood on the sidewalk across the street, clutching the brass key in her pocket and trying to summon the courage to enter. The October afternoon was growing late, and she knew the bank would close soon, but something held her back. What if this was another trap? What if Jackson somehow knew about the safety deposit box and was using it to lure her into some new form of humiliation or legal jeopardy? After Elena's arrest and Victoria's threats, Madison had good reason to be paranoid about anything that seemed too convenient or helpful. But as she stood there, paralyzed by indecision, Madison realized she had reached the point where caution was a luxury she could no longer afford. Elena was in prison, her medical records had been falsified, and Jackson was closing in for the final destruction of her life. If this safety deposit box contained nothing but empty disappointment, she would be no worse off than she already was. Madison crossed the street and entered the bank's marble lobby. The interior was designed to intimidate as much as impress, with soaring ceilings, classical columns, and an atmosphere of hushed reverence for money and power. She approached the information desk, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair looked up with a professional smile. "I'd like to access a safety deposit box," Madison said, producing the brass key. "Box number 479. The woman, whose nameplate identified her as Mrs. Patricia Chen, examined the key with practiced eyes. "Certainly, ma'am. I'll need to see some identification and verify your signature against our records." Madison handed over her driver's license, her heart pounding as Mrs. Chen typed information into her computer. There was a long moment of silence as the woman read whatever information appeared on her screen, and Madison prepared herself for the crushing disappointment of learning that she had no access to the box. "Everything appears to be in order, Mrs. Blackwood," Mrs. Chen said, though there was a note of curiosity in her voice. "Though I should mention that this box hasn't been accessed in quite some time, nearly 2 years according to our records." 2 years! That would place the last access right around the time of Thomas Blackwood Sr.'s death. Madison felt a flutter of excitement as Mrs. Chen led her through a series of security doors and into the bank's vault area. The safety deposit box section was a windowless room lined with numbered metal boxes, each requiring 2 keys to open, one held by the bank and one by the customer. Box 479 was located in the middle section of the wall, unremarkable among its neighbors. Mrs. Chen inserted the bank's key while Madison used the brass key she had found in her music box. Both keys turned smoothly, and the metal door swung open to reveal a long, narrow drawer. "I'll give you some privacy," Mrs. Chen said, gesturing toward a small private room adjacent to the vault. "Take as much time as you need." Madison carried the drawer into the private room and set it on the small table provided for customers. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid, not knowing whether she would find treasure or disappointment inside. The drawer contained a single manila envelope, thick with documents. Madison's name was written on the front in elegant handwriting that she recognized as belonging to Thomas Blackwood Sr. Below her name, in the same careful script, were the words, "To be opened only in the event of Jackson's betrayal." Madison's breath caught in her throat as she opened the envelope and began reading the first document. It was a will, dated just 6 weeks before Thomas Sr.'s death, but it was completely different from the will that had been read at his funeral. According to this document, Thomas Blackwood had left 51% of Blackwood Industries stock to Madison Carter to be held in trust for his grandchild until the child reached the age of 25. The remaining 49% was divided between Jackson and various charitable organizations. It was not just a different distribution of assets, it was a completely different vision of who should control the company Thomas Sr. had spent his life building. But even more shocking than the will itself was the letter that accompanied it, written in Thomas Sr.'s distinctive handwriting. My dear Madison, if you are reading this, it means that my worst fears about my son have been realized. Jackson has chosen the path of cruelty and betrayal, and you have paid the price for his moral bankruptcy. I want you to know that your marriage to Jackson was not the accident it appeared to be. I had been watching you for some time before you met my son, watching your career, your character, your integrity in the face of the corruption that plagues the financial industry. When I learned that Jackson was planning to marry, I hoped that a woman of your caliber might influence him toward becoming the man I had always hoped he could be. I arranged for you to be assigned to the Morgan Stanley team that handled our IPO, and I made sure you and Jackson would meet at the celebration party. I had hoped that love might accomplish what decades of fatherly guidance had failed to achieve. I see now that I was naive in my expectations of both love and my son. Jackson is brilliant, charming, and utterly without conscience. He sees people as assets to be acquired or obstacles to be eliminated. I built Blackwood Industries to create jobs, to drive innovation, and to leave the world a better place than I found it. Jackson has transformed it into a weapon for his own aggrandizement, and I cannot allow that legacy to continue. You may wonder why I have chosen you to inherit control of my company. It is because in the 18 months I have known you, I have seen qualities that Jackson lacks: compassion, integrity, and a genuine concern for the welfare of others. More importantly, you have the educational background and analytical skills necessary to run a complex organization. Your MBA from Wharton and your experience at Morgan Stanley qualify you far better than Jackson's sense of entitlement ever could. I know this inheritance will make you a target of Jackson's rage, but I believe you are strong enough to withstand his attacks and wise enough to use this power responsibly. The company employs more than 50,000 people worldwide, and their livelihoods depend on ethical leadership. I am entrusting their futures to you. The will that Jackson filed with the court after my death was a forgery. I suspected he might attempt such a deception, so I took precautions. All the documentation you need to prove your claim is contained in this envelope, including video testimony I recorded just days before my death. My personal attorney, Charles Morrison, has the only other copies of these documents. Be careful, Madison. Jackson will not surrender power easily, and he has resources that most people cannot imagine. But remember that you are not just fighting for yourself or even for your child. You are fighting for the soul of a company and the welfare of thousands of employees who deserve better than Jackson's sociopathic leadership. Use this power wisely, and may God protect you in the battles ahead. Thomas Blackwood, Sr. Madison read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. Thomas Sr. hadn't just left her money or a small bequest. He had left her control of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. She wasn't just a cast-off ex-wife with a modest settlement. She was the rightful heir to one of the most powerful tech companies in the world. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, Madison understood the magnitude of the danger she now faced. If Jackson had been willing to forge one will, if he had systematically destroyed Elena's life for much less provocation, what would he do when he discovered that his father had effectively disinherited him in favor of the woman he had just divorced? Madison spent the next hour reading through the other documents in the envelope: corporate bylaws, stock certificates, banking records, correspondence between Thomas Sr. and his personal attorney. Everything she would need to prove her claim to Blackwood Industries. There were also detailed financial records showing that Jackson had been systematically looting the company's pension fund and using corporate assets for personal expenses, violations that would result in criminal charges if exposed. Most compelling of all was a flash drive containing video testimony recorded by Thomas Sr. just days before his death. In the video, he explained his decision to leave control of the company to Madison, detailed Jackson's unfitness to lead, and provided sworn testimony about the authenticity of the will and supporting documents. Madison also found correspondence between Thomas Sr. and Charles Morrison, his personal attorney, outlining their plan to keep the true will secret until it was needed. Morrison had been instructed to monitor Jackson's behavior and to make the real will public only if Jackson proved himself unworthy of his inheritance through acts of cruelty or betrayal. As Madison pieced together the timeline, she realized that Thomas Sr. had been planning this transfer of power for months before his death. He had seen the signs of Jackson's moral corruption and had taken steps to protect both his company and his future daughter-in-law from his son's destructive impulses. But one crucial question remained unanswered. Where was Charles Morrison, and why hadn't he come forward with this information during Madison's divorce proceedings? Madison found her answer in the last document in the envelope, a newspaper clipping reporting Morrison's death in a car accident just 2 weeks after Thomas Sr.'s funeral. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Madison felt a chill as she realized that Jackson had probably eliminated Morrison to prevent him from revealing the true will. If Jackson had committed murder once to protect his inheritance, he would certainly be willing to kill again to prevent Madison from claiming what was rightfully hers. Madison carefully returned all the documents to the envelope and made arrangements with Mrs. Chen to continue renting the safety deposit box. She also made copies of the most important documents, storing them in multiple locations to prevent Jackson from destroying the evidence, as he had apparently done with Morrison. As she left the bank, Madison felt a mixture of elation and terror. She now had the legal ammunition to destroy Jackson and claim her rightful inheritance. But she also understood that she was essentially declaring war on one of the most powerful and ruthless men in America. Jackson had already demonstrated his willingness to frame innocent people for federal crimes and possibly commit murder to protect his interests. Madison had no illusions about what he might do to prevent her from exposing his crimes and claiming control of Blackwood Industries. But for the first time since her divorce, Madison felt like she had a real chance of fighting back. Thomas Sr. had given her more than just documents and legal claims. He had given her the truth about Jackson's character and the validation that she was capable of something greater than being a trophy wife. The war was about to begin, and Madison finally had weapons worthy of her enemy. Madison spent the entire night in her Astoria apartment, reading and rereading every document from Thomas Sr.'s safety deposit box. She wanted to understand every detail, every legal nuance, every piece of evidence that would support her claim to Blackwood Industries. By dawn, she had developed a comprehensive strategy for exposing Jackson's crimes and claiming her inheritance. Her first priority was contacting Charles Morrison's law firm to see if any of his colleagues were aware of Thomas Sr.'s true will. Madison discovered that Morrison had been a solo practitioner, but he had maintained an office manager named Dorothy Walsh who had worked with him for over 30 years. If anyone knew about the secret documents, it would be her. Madison called Walsh's number at 8 in the morning, hoping to catch her before the business day began. Walsh answered on the second ring, her voice cautious when Madison identified herself as Thomas Blackwood's daughter-in-law. "Mrs. Blackwood, I wondered if you would ever call," Walsh said quietly. Charles was very specific in his instructions about what to do if something happened to him. He said that if you ever contacted me, I should tell you that the eagle has landed. The phrase meant nothing to Madison, but Walsh explained that it was a code Morrison had established to indicate that his backup plan had been activated. Morrison had been paranoid about Jackson's potential for violence, and he had taken precautions to ensure that evidence of Thomas Sr.'s true will could survive even if he didn't. Charles maintained a digital vault with a company called Secure Archive, Walsh explained. All of Mr. Blackwood's documents were uploaded there, along with video testimony and other evidence. The access codes are in Charles's safe, but I can get them for you if you come to the office this afternoon. Madison felt a surge of relief. If Morrison had created digital backups of all the evidence, Jackson couldn't destroy the truth simply by burning physical documents or eliminating witnesses. But even as she made plans to meet with Walsh, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that Jackson was already several steps ahead of her. That feeling proved prophetic when she arrived at Morrison's office building later that afternoon. Fire trucks surrounded the structure, and smoke was pouring from the windows of the third floor, where Morrison's practice had been located. Madison watched in horror as firefighters battled the blaze that was consuming what might have been her only chance of accessing Morrison's backup files. "Terrible accident," said a familiar voice behind her. Madison turned to find Jackson standing there, impeccably dressed despite the chaos around them. His expression showed the perfect amount of concern for someone witnessing a tragic fire, but his eyes held the cold satisfaction of a predator who had just eliminated a threat. "How did you know I was here?" Madison asked, though she already suspected the answer. "I make it my business to know where my ex-wife spends her time," Jackson replied smoothly, "especially when she's visiting law offices and asking questions about long-dead attorneys. It's almost as if you're looking for something, Madison, something that might not belong to you." The implication was clear. Jackson knew about the safety deposit box, about Morrison's backup files, about everything. He had been watching her movements and had acted preemptively to destroy any evidence that might threaten his control of Blackwood Industries. "The fire investigator is saying it looks like an electrical problem," Jackson continued conversationally. "Very common in these older buildings. Faulty wiring, overloaded circuits. These things happen all the time." Unfortunately, Mr. Morrison's entire practice was destroyed. All his files, his client records, his computer systems, everything turned to ash. Madison felt her last hope crumbling as she watched the flames consume Morrison's office. Without the backup files, she had only the documents from the safety deposit box, and Jackson's lawyers would undoubtedly claim those were forgeries. The video testimony from Thomas Sr. might be authentic, but Jackson had enough money to hire experts who would swear it was fabricated. "Of course," Jackson said, stepping closer so that only Madison could hear his words. "Even if someone claimed to have copies of documents that were supposedly stored in that office, who would believe them? After all, the originals are gone, and digital files can be fabricated so easily these days. Without independent verification from the original source, any so-called evidence would be dismissed as the desperate fantasies of a bitter ex-wife." Madison realized with growing horror that Jackson had planned this perfectly. Even if she produced her copies of Thomas Sr.'s will and the supporting documents, his legal team would argue that she had forged them after Morrison's convenient death. Without Morrison's testimony or his backup files, she had no way to prove their authenticity. "You killed your own father's legacy," Madison whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of sirens and shouting firefighters. "I protected it," Jackson corrected her, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. "My father was a sentimental old man who let emotions cloud his business judgment. He built Blackwood Industries through ruthless efficiency and cold calculation, but in his final years, he became weak. He started caring about employee welfare and corporate responsibility and other luxuries that successful companies can't afford." Jackson's mask of false concern slipped completely, revealing the sociopathic ambition that lay beneath his polished exterior. "I turned Blackwood Industries into what it is today, a lean, profitable machine that destroys its competitors without mercy. I wasn't about to let an old man's deathbed guilt hand my life's work over to someone who would run it into the ground with compassion and ethics." As Jackson spoke, Madison noticed that several people were watching their conversation with obvious interest. She realized that he was deliberately speaking loudly enough for others to hear, establishing witnesses to his presence at the fire scene while simultaneously threatening her with complete impunity. "You should go home, Madison," Jackson said, his voice returning to its normal volume as he prepared to leave. "Forget about whatever fantasies you've been entertaining about hidden inheritances and secret documents. You're a divorced woman with a modest settlement and a child on the way. Focus on building a quiet life for yourself and stop meddling in affairs that are beyond your understanding." As Jackson walked away, Madison felt the full weight of her defeat crushing down on her. She had found the evidence she needed to expose his crimes and claim her inheritance, but he had systematically eliminated every advantage she thought she possessed. Morrison was dead, his backup files were destroyed, and Jackson's resources seemed unlimited. But as Madison stood there watching the fire consume her hopes, she remembered something Jackson had said that didn't quite fit. He had mentioned that she was asking questions about long-dead attorneys, but Morrison had only been dead for 2 years. It was a small slip, but it suggested that Jackson might not know everything about her investigation. More importantly, Madison realized that Jackson's confidence might be his weakness. He was so certain of his control, so convinced of his intellectual superiority, that he might underestimate her determination and resourcefulness. Thomas Sr. had chosen her as his heir for good reasons, and Madison was beginning to understand that she possessed strengths Jackson couldn't appreciate because he had never had to develop them himself. The war was far from over. Jackson had won this battle by destroying Morrison's files, but Madison still had the original documents from the safety deposit box. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that her real weapon wasn't legal documents or video testimony. It was her own intelligence and moral clarity, qualities that Jackson could never possess or fully comprehend. As Madison walked away from the burning building, she began planning her next move. Jackson thought he had eliminated all threats to his power, but he had made one crucial error. He had underestimated the woman his father had chosen as his successor. And that mistake was going to cost him everything. Madison returned to her apartment that evening, feeling more alone and vulnerable than she had ever felt in her life. Morrison's office was ash. Elena was in federal prison, and Jackson seemed to anticipate her every move with terrifying precision. As she sat on her second-hand couch, staring at the copies of Thomas Sr.'s documents, Madison began to wonder if fighting Jackson was not just futile, but actively dangerous for her unborn child. Her phone rang, interrupting her dark thoughts. The caller ID showed Dr. Sarah Collins, her therapist. "Madison, thank God you answered," Dr. Collins said, her voice tight with urgency. "I've been trying to reach you all day. There's been a development with the surveillance situation that you need to know about immediately." Madison felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Dr. Collins had discovered additional evidence of Jackson's illegal activities, something that could help rebuild the case against him. "I can't discuss this over the phone," Dr. Collins continued. "Can you come to my office right away? I know it's late, but this can't wait until tomorrow." An hour later, Madison sat in the familiar beige office where she had spent so many sessions trying to work through her anxiety about motherhood and marriage, but something felt different this time. Dr. Collins seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact and fidgeting with papers on her desk in a way that was completely unlike her usual composed demeanor. "Madison, what I'm about to tell you is going to be very difficult to hear," Dr. Collins began, her voice lacking its usual warmth and authority. "The FBI has approached me about Jackson's surveillance network. They want to offer you protection, but they need your full cooperation." Dr. Collins pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and placed them on the coffee table between their chairs. "These are cooperation agreements. The FBI needs you to sign them before they can move forward with their investigation." Madison began reading through the documents, but the legal language was dense and confusing. References to grand jury testimony, witness protection protocols, asset forfeiture provisions. It all seemed legitimate, but something about the situation felt wrong. "I should have a lawyer review these before I sign anything," Madison said. "Of course, but time is critical," Dr. Collins replied, her nervousness becoming more obvious. "The FBI believes Jackson is planning to flee the country. If we don't move quickly, he'll escape justice entirely." As Dr. Collins spoke, Madison noticed that her therapist was sweating despite the cool temperature in the office. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she kept glancing toward her desk where a cell phone lay with its screen illuminated, suggesting an active call. "Who's on the phone?" Madison asked quietly. Dr. Collins's facade began to crack. "Madison, please, just sign the papers. It's for your own protection." "Who's on the phone?" Madison repeated, her voice stronger now as understanding began to dawn. The office door opened before Dr. Collins could answer, and Jackson Blackwood walked in with the casual confidence of a man entering his own home. Behind him came Victoria, carrying her ever-present briefcase, and two men in expensive suits who had the unmistakable bearing of professional enforcers. "Hello, darling," Jackson said, settling into the chair beside Madison, as if they were still happily married. "I hope Sarah has been taking good care of you. She's been such a valuable member of our team." Madison stared at Dr. Collins in horror as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. "You work for him. You've been working for him all along." "Sarah has been exceptionally helpful," Jackson confirmed, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a chess player who had just achieved checkmate. Did you really think I would allow my wife to spend an hour every week sharing her deepest secrets with a stranger without ensuring that I heard every word? The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that Madison felt something fundamental break inside her chest. The woman she had trusted with her most vulnerable fears, her private doubts about motherhood, her desperate loneliness during the collapse of her marriage, she had been Jackson's spy from the very beginning. Every session was recorded, Victoria added, pulling documents from her briefcase with the efficiency of a surgeon selecting instruments. Your admissions of anxiety about the pregnancy, your fears about being an adequate mother, your concerns about your mental stability, it's all documented. Jackson leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed now that his trap was fully revealed. Madison, I want you to understand something important. This was never personal. It was always business. I needed a wife for appearances, someone respectable and attractive who wouldn't interfere with my actual priorities. You served that purpose admirably for 3 years. But then you became pregnant, he continued, his voice taking on a tone of mild annoyance. And that complicated things. You see, I can't allow my heir to be raised by someone whose judgment is so clearly compromised. The recordings from these therapy sessions provide ample evidence of your unfitness as a mother. Victoria placed a new set of documents on the coffee table. These custody agreements grant Jackson full legal and physical custody of the child upon birth. In exchange, you'll receive an additional payment of $3 million dollars and the assurance that your child will have every possible advantage in life. Madison looked at the custody papers, understanding that this had been Jackson's plan all along. The divorce, the settlement, even her attempts to fight back. It had all been orchestrated to lead to this moment when she would be forced to surrender her child to avoid complete destruction. What if I refuse? Madison asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Jackson's expression hardened. Then you'll discover just how deep my influence extends in this city. Family court judges, child protective services workers, police officers, medical professionals, they all have mortgages to pay and favors to return. You'll be declared an unfit mother based on your own recorded admissions of mental instability, and I'll gain custody anyway. The only difference is that you'll receive nothing for your cooperation. As if summoned by Jackson's threats, Madison felt a sharp contraction tear through her abdomen. The stress of the situation, the overwhelming realization of her complete powerlessness, was affecting her body in ways that terrified her. She gasped and doubled over, her hands instinctively moving to protect her belly. "Oh my," Victoria said with false concern. "That doesn't look good at all. Perhaps we should call an ambulance. Premature labor can be so dangerous for both mother and child." Madison realized with growing panic that even her physical distress was playing into Jackson's hands. A medical emergency would provide the perfect cover for the next phase of his plan, whatever that might be. As another contraction hit, stronger than the first, Madison understood that she was about to lose the last thing that mattered to her, not just custody of her child, but possibly the child itself. "Don't worry, darling," Jackson said, already reaching for his phone to call 911. "I'll make sure you get the best possible medical care. After all, we need to ensure that our baby is born healthy, even if you won't be the one raising it." As the paramedics arrived and Madison was loaded onto a stretcher, she caught Jackson's eye one last time. In that moment, she saw not just triumph, but something far more chilling, the complete absence of any human feeling whatsoever. Jackson Blackwood was not just cruel or selfish. He was fundamentally hollow, a perfect predator who felt nothing for anyone beyond their utility to his own ambitions. And now he was about to become the father of her child. The ambulance ride to Metropolitan General Hospital passed in a blur of sirens, medical equipment, and paramedics working to stabilize Madison's premature contractions. Through her pain and fear, she was dimly aware of Jackson riding alongside her, playing the role of concerned ex-husband with Oscar-worthy conviction. He held her hand, spoke in soothing tone to the paramedics, and projected exactly the right mixture of worry and competence that would make him appear to be the responsible parent in any future custody proceedings. At the hospital, Madison was rushed into the maternity ward where a team of doctors and nurses worked to stop her labor. At 34 weeks, her baby needed more time to develop, and the medical staff was clearly concerned about the risks of premature delivery. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the attending physician, was a competent-looking woman in her 40s who seemed genuinely dedicated to providing the best possible care. "We're going to do everything we can to stop the contractions," Dr. Martinez told Madison as nurses hooked her up to various monitoring devices. "Your baby needs at least a few more weeks to develop properly. We're starting you on medication to relax the uterine muscles and slow down the labor process." Through the haze of pain and medical intervention, Madison saw Jackson speaking quietly with Dr. Martinez in the hallway outside her room. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she noticed Jackson pulling out his checkbook and writing something down. When Dr. Martinez returned to Madison's bedside, her demeanor had subtly changed from warm professionalism to cautious distance. As the hours passed, Madison's contractions gradually subsided under the influence of powerful medications. But the drugs left her feeling drowsy and disoriented, making it difficult to think clearly or maintain her guard against Jackson's machinations. Every time she tried to focus on planning her next move, another wave of medicinal fog would wash over her consciousness. It was during one of these drowsy periods that Madison overheard Jackson talking on his phone outside her room. His voice was low, but the hospital corridors carried sound better than he realized. "The incompetency petition has been filed with the family court," Jackson was saying. "Dr. Collins's testimony about Madison's mental instability, combined with this medical emergency, should provide sufficient grounds. Yes, I understand the timing is critical. The moment the baby is born, I need full legal custody and medical decision-making authority." Madison's blood ran cold as the implications of Jackson's words sank in. An incompetency petition meant he was trying to have her declared mentally unfit to make her own decisions. If successful, he would gain control not just over their child, but over Madison herself. Her medical care, her finances, her legal rights, everything would fall under Jackson's authority. Madison tried to sit up and call for help, but the medications had left her movements slow and uncoordinated. When she pressed the call button, a young nurse appeared, a woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile who seemed to care about her patient's well-being. "I need to call my lawyer," Madison whispered urgently. "It's important." "Of course, honey," the nurse replied. "Let me get you access to a phone." But as the nurse turned to leave, Jackson appeared in the doorway with the timing of someone who had been listening to every word. "Is there a problem here?" Jackson asked, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who had just made a substantial donation to the hospital's building fund. "Mrs. Blackwood wanted to make a phone call," the nurse explained. Jackson's expression showed the perfect amount of concerned confusion. "I'm not sure that's wise in her current condition. The medications can cause disorientation and paranoia. Perhaps it would be better if she focused on resting and recovering." The nurse looked uncertain, caught between her patient's clear request and the wishes of what appeared to be a wealthy and influential family member. The doctor did emphasize the importance of rest. "Exactly," Jackson said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "And as her emergency contact and the father of her child, I think it's best if we limit visitors and phone calls until Madison is more stable." Madison watched helplessly as Jackson effectively placed her under house arrest in her own hospital room. The nurse left with obvious reluctance, but she was clearly unwilling to defy the wishes of someone who wielded Jackson's level of influence within the hospital hierarchy. As the night wore on, Madison's situation became increasingly dire. Jackson had positioned himself as her advocate and protector, making it impossible for her to communicate with the outside world without his knowledge and approval. Nurses and doctors deferred to his judgment about her care, treating him as the responsible party while viewing Madison as an unstable patient whose requests should be filtered through her more reliable ex-husband. Late that night, when the hospital had settled into the quiet rhythm of overnight operations, Victoria appeared at Madison's bedside. She was accompanied by a male orderly and carrying what appeared to be official paperwork. "Time for a little procedure," Victoria said with false cheerfulness. "Nothing serious, just some administrative matters that need to be taken care of while you're here." Madison tried to resist as they helped her into a wheelchair, but the medications had left her weak and confused. Victoria and the orderly wheeled her through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly under harsh fluorescent lighting, past empty nurses' stations and locked office doors. They stopped at an administrative office in a section of the hospital that Madison didn't recognize. Inside, a nervous-looking man sat behind a desk covered with legal documents. His nameplate identified him as David Patterson, notary public, and his hands shook slightly as he arranged papers in neat piles. "This won't take long," Victoria assured Madison as they positioned her wheelchair beside the desk. "Just some routine paperwork about your medical care and the baby's future welfare." Akaram, but as Madison's vision cleared slightly, she could see that these documents were anything but routine. She recognized custody agreements, power of attorney forms, and most chillingly, what appeared to be a DNR order, a directive that would prevent medical staff from resuscitating her if something went wrong during delivery. "I won't sign these," Madison said, though her voice was barely a whisper. "You already have," Victoria replied calmly, showing Madison the documents where her signature appeared on every page. The forgeries were expertly done, but Madison could see subtle differences in the handwriting that proved they were fake. "Mr. Patterson here will witness that you signed these documents of your own free will," Victoria continued. "Won't you, David?" The notary nodded quickly, his fear obvious. It was clear that he had been bought, threatened, or both. Madison realized that Jackson's plan was even more comprehensive than she had imagined. He wasn't just trying to gain custody of their child. He was positioning himself to eliminate Madison entirely if she continued to resist his demands. The DNR order was particularly sinister. If Madison experienced complications during delivery, the hospital staff would be legally prohibited from taking heroic measures to save her life. Jackson could eliminate his most dangerous enemy while appearing to be a grieving widower who had simply followed his ex-wife's own medical directives. As they wheeled Madison back to her room, she felt a crushing despair unlike anything she had ever experienced. Jackson had anticipated every possible avenue of resistance and had systematically eliminated her ability to fight back. She was trapped in a hospital controlled by his money and influence, her body weakened by drugs, her legal rights stripped away by forged documents. But even in the depths of that despair, a small spark of anger began to grow. Jackson had made one crucial mistake in his perfect plan. He had underestimated Madison's will to survive and protect her child. And sometimes when a person has absolutely nothing left to lose, that's when they become most dangerous. As Madison lay in her hospital bed, listening to the sounds of the medical equipment that monitored her and her baby's vital signs, she began to remember details from her previous life that Jackson had probably forgotten. Her years at Morgan Stanley hadn't just taught her about financial analysis and investment strategies. They had also taught her about reading people, recognizing deception, and finding weaknesses in seemingly impregnable systems. Jackson's confidence was about to become his downfall, and Madison was ready to show him that even a trapped and wounded animal could still bite. The morning after Victoria's midnight visit brought Madison a clarity of thought she hadn't experienced since her arrival at the hospital. The medications were wearing off, and with them, the fog that had clouded her ability to think strategically. As she lay in her hospital bed, watching Jackson hold court with various medical staff members who treated him like visiting royalty, Madison began to remember something that could change everything. 3 months earlier, when the stress of her failing marriage had become unbearable, Madison had started carrying a small digital voice recorder in her purse. Initially, it had been intended as a kind of audio diary, a way to record her thoughts and feelings about the pregnancy and her deteriorating relationship with Jackson. She had found that speaking her fears aloud helped her process them better than simply writing in a journal. But as Jackson's psychological abuse had intensified, Madison had begun leaving the recorder running during their conversations, not with any specific plan to use the recordings against him, but simply because she had started to doubt her own perceptions of reality. Jackson was a master manipulator who could make her question her own memories of conversations that had happened just hours earlier. The recorder had become her way of maintaining some connection to objective truth. Madison had completely forgotten about the device during the chaos of the divorce proceedings and custody battle, but now she remembered that it was still in her purse, which the hospital staff had stored in the small closet adjacent to her bed. If the recorder had been running during any of her recent encounters with Jackson, Victoria, or Dr. Collins, she might have captured evidence that could expose their conspiracy. The challenge was retrieving the recorder without attracting attention. Jackson had positioned himself as Madison's protector and advocate, which meant that any unusual behavior on her part would be immediately reported to him as evidence of her mental instability. Madison needed to access her purse and check the recorder while appearing to engage in completely normal hospital patient activities. Her opportunity came during the afternoon shift change, when the nurses were busy with handoff reports and Jackson had stepped away to take a phone call. Madison carefully got out of bed and made her way to the closet, moving slowly to avoid triggering any monitoring alarms. Her purse was exactly where she remembered it, tucked behind a stack of hospital gowns. The digital recorder was still there, a small silver device about the size of a credit card. Madison's heart pounded as she checked the memory display and realized that the device had been running almost continuously for the past week. Hours and hours of conversations, including her meeting with Elena at the coffee shop, her confrontation with Victoria in her apartment, and most importantly, her session with Dr. Collins when Jackson had revealed the true scope of his manipulation. Madison carefully transferred the most important files to her phone using the recorder's Bluetooth capability, then returned the device to her purse and made her way back to bed. For the first time in days, she felt like she had a real weapon in her war against Jackson's machinations. But having evidence was only useful if she could get it to someone who could act on it. Jackson controlled her access to phones, visitors, and even medical staff. Madison needed an ally, someone who could move freely within the hospital without arousing suspicion or being influenced by Jackson's money and threats. That ally presented herself in the form of Maria Santos, the night cleaning staff member who had been working at Metropolitan General for over 20 years. Maria was a small, quiet woman in her 50s who spoke limited English, but possessed the kind of invisible presence that allowed her to move through the hospital largely unnoticed. Madison had observed her during the long nights, quietly going about her work while the medical staff focused on their more dramatic responsibilities. There was something in Maria's eyes that suggested she had seen abuse before and recognized the signs. When Maria came to clean Madison's room that night, Madison took a desperate chance. "Maria," she whispered in the Spanish she had learned during her college years, "I need your help. I'm in great danger." Maria paused in her cleaning, studying Madison's face with sharp, intelligent eyes. After a moment, she moved closer to the bed, continuing to dust the nightstand while positioning herself to hear Madison's quiet words. "My ex-husband is trying to take my baby and possibly kill me," Madison continued in Spanish. "I have evidence of his crimes, but I can't contact anyone who can help me." Maria's expression showed that she understood both the language and the gravity of the situation. "What do you need?" she asked quietly. Madison explained about the recordings and gave Maria a phone number she had memorized years earlier. "This is my friend Cameron Brooks. He works for the FBI. Please call him and tell him that Madison needs help. Tell him I have evidence of crimes by Jackson Blackwood and that I'm being held against my will at Metropolitan General Hospital." Cameron Brooks was a name from Madison's past, her college boyfriend who had joined the FBI after graduation. They had remained friends even after their romantic relationship ended, and Madison knew that if anyone would believe her story and act on the evidence, it would be Cameron. He had always possessed an unshakable moral compass and a deep hatred of bullies and abusers. Madison carefully transferred a copy of her most damning recordings to a small flash drive she found in her purse. She pressed both the drive and a handwritten note into Maria's weathered hands. "Please be careful," Madison whispered. "The man who is doing this has killed people to protect his secrets. If he discovers that you're helping me—" Maria's expression hardened with a determination that reminded Madison that this woman had probably survived challenges that made Jackson's threats seem trivial by comparison. "Don't worry about me, mija. I know how to be invisible." As Maria quietly left the room, Madison felt the first real hope she had experienced since Elena's arrest. Cameron would know what to do with the evidence, and more importantly, he would have the resources and authority to act on it quickly. Madison spent the rest of the night lying awake, listening to the sounds of the hospital and praying that Maria would reach Cameron safely. Outside her window, the lights of Manhattan twinkled like distant stars, and Madison tried to imagine a future where she and her child were free from Jackson's control. Cameron Brooks had always been the type of person who transformed from casual friend to fierce protector the moment someone he cared about was in danger. When Maria Santos called him at 6 in the morning with a broken English account of Madison's situation, Cameron was in his car and driving toward Metropolitan General Hospital within 15 minutes. Cameron had spent the years since college building a reputation as one of the FBI's most effective investigators of white-collar crime and political corruption. His specialty was cases involving the intersection of wealth and power, and he had developed a particular hatred for criminals who use their resources to escape justice. When Maria played him the recordings Madison had captured, Cameron realized he was looking at one of the most comprehensive criminal conspiracies he had ever encountered. The recordings were devastating. Jackson's admission that he had orchestrated Elena's arrest and imprisonment, his detailed explanation of how he had been monitoring Madison through illegal surveillance, his confession that he had forged his father's will and eliminated Charles Morrison to protect his theft of the inheritance. Most damning of all was his casual discussion of the DNR order and his plans to use Madison's medical emergency to gain complete control over her life and their child. But Cameron also understood that the recordings alone wouldn't be enough to bring down someone with Jackson's resources and connections. He needed to move quickly and decisively, using the full power of federal law enforcement, before Jackson realized that his crimes had been exposed. Cameron's first call was to his supervisor, Assistant Director Patricia Williams, who authorized an immediate investigation based on the evidence Madison had provided. His second call was to the U.S. Attorney's Office, where prosecutors began preparing federal warrants for Jackson's arrest. His third call was to the hospital's chief of staff, demanding immediate access to Madison under federal witness protection protocols. By 10 o'clock that morning, Cameron was standing in Madison's hospital room with two other FBI agents in a court order that removed Jackson's control over her medical care. Madison had never been so happy to see a familiar face in her entire life. "Madison, I'm sorry it took so long to find you," Cameron said, his familiar voice a welcome sound after days of enemies and false friends. "But we're here now, and you're safe." The recordings Madison had captured proved to be even more valuable than Cameron had initially realized. Not only did they contain Jackson's confessions about the forged will and his manipulation of Madison's custody situation, but they also revealed the existence of a massive criminal network that extended far beyond Blackwood Industries. "Your ex-husband has been running an illegal surveillance and blackmail operation for years," Cameron explained as they reviewed the evidence together. "He's been gathering compromising information on judges, politicians, business leaders, medical professionals, anyone who might be useful to him or who might pose a threat to his interests." Cameron pulled out a laptop and showed Madison a complex organizational chart that his team had been building based on her recordings and other evidence they had gathered. "We've been investigating Blackwood Industries for months as part of a larger probe into corporate corruption, but we needed evidence of Jackson's personal involvement in criminal activities." The most shocking revelation came when Cameron played back a portion of Madison's recording that she hadn't fully understood at the time. It was from the dinner party at Jackson's penthouse 2 months before their divorce, and in the background, barely audible above the conversation and clinking glasses, was Jackson discussing a federal court case with Judge Elizabeth Warren. "This is Judge Warren agreeing to fix a custody ruling in exchange for a favorable business decision from Jackson," Cameron explained. "She's been on our radar for judicial corruption for over a year, but we could never prove it. This recording is going to bring down a network of corruption that reaches into the highest levels of the justice system." As they spoke, Cameron's phone rang constantly with updates from other FBI teams across the city. The investigation was moving at lightning speed, with agents executing search warrants at Blackwood Industries, Victoria's law office, Dr. Collins' practice, and a dozen other locations connected to Jackson's criminal network. "Elena Rodriguez didn't commit suicide," Cameron told Madison, his voice heavy with the weight of justice finally being served. "We arrested the corrections officer who murdered her on Jackson's orders just 2 hours ago. He's already cooperating, giving us names and details about other crimes Jackson ordered from inside the prison system." Madison felt a mixture of grief and vindication wash over her. Elena had died trying to expose Jackson's crimes, but her sacrifice had not been in vain. The evidence Elena had gathered, combined with Madison's recordings, was finally bringing Jackson's empire of corruption crashing down. The biggest surprise came when Cameron revealed that Madison hadn't been as isolated and powerless as she had believed. Thomas Blackwood Sr.'s former personal assistant, an elderly woman named Margaret Ellis, had been quietly gathering evidence of Jackson's forgeries and criminal activities for nearly 2 years. She contacted us 6 months ago, Cameron explained. She suspected that the will Jackson filed after his father's death was fake, but she needed proof. When she heard about your divorce and the custody battle, she realized you might be the key to exposing the truth. Margaret Ellis arrived at the hospital that afternoon, a dignified woman in her 70s who carried herself with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in positions of trust and responsibility. She brought with her a briefcase full of documents that painted a clear picture of Jackson's systematic destruction of his father's legacy. I worked for Thomas Blackwood for 43 years, Margaret said, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion. He was a good man who built his company on principles of integrity and social responsibility. What his son became? She shook her head sadly. Thomas would be heartbroken, but he would also be proud of you, dear. You're fighting for his grandchild and his legacy the way he would have wanted. Margaret had copies of Thomas Sr.'s real will, correspondence between father and son that documented their growing estrangement, and most importantly, handwriting analysis conducted by forensic experts that proved the filed will was a forgery. She had also maintained digital copies of Thomas Sr.'s video testimony, stored on secure servers that Jackson had never discovered. I've been waiting for the right moment to come forward, Margaret explained. I knew that if I revealed the truth too early, Jackson would find a way to destroy the evidence and eliminate anyone who threatened him. But when Cameron contacted me about your situation, I realized that the time had finally come. As the day progressed, the scope of Jackson's downfall became clear. Federal agents had seized control of Blackwood Industries' headquarters, freezing assets and beginning a comprehensive audit of the company's financial records. Victoria's law practice was being searched for evidence of conspiracy and fraud. Dr. Collins had been arrested at her office, where agents discovered an entire room full of surveillance equipment and illegally obtained patient files. The media coverage was extensive and growing by the hour. Tech mogul arrested in massive federal corruption probe. FBI uncovers years-long criminal conspiracy. Pregnant woman's secret recordings expose billionaire's crimes. Madison watched the coverage from her hospital bed, where she was recovering from the stress and medication effects of the past week. Her baby was safe and healthy, the doctors assured her, though they wanted to monitor her closely for the remainder of her pregnancy. Cameron appeared on the evening news, standing in front of the FBI building as he addressed a crowd of reporters and cameras. This investigation has revealed one of the most sophisticated criminal networks we have ever encountered, he said, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, finally delivering justice. Jackson Blackwood used his position and wealth to corrupt officials, manipulate legal proceedings, and eliminate anyone who threatened his power. But he made one crucial mistake. He underestimated the courage and intelligence of the woman he tried to destroy. The legal proceedings against Jackson Blackwood and his conspirators moved with unprecedented speed. Federal prosecutors, armed with Madison's recordings and Margaret Ellis's documentation, had built an overwhelming case that left little room for the expensive legal maneuvering that had protected Jackson throughout his career. Jackson was arrested at his penthouse at dawn on a Tuesday morning, led away in handcuffs while news cameras captured every moment of his downfall. The charges were extensive: racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, judicial bribery, illegal surveillance, and first-degree murder in the death of Elena Rodriguez. With the evidence against him, Jackson's lawyers advised him that pleading guilty and cooperating with federal investigators was his only hope of avoiding life in prison. Victoria Blackwood's arrest came the same day, as FBI agents found her in her law office frantically shredding documents that contained evidence of her participation in the conspiracy. She was charged with conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of legal malpractice. The State Bar Association moved immediately to revoke her license, and she faced decades in federal prison. Dr. Sarah Collins was taken into custody at her practice, where federal agents discovered not just the surveillance equipment used to record Madison's sessions, but an entire database of illegally obtained patient information from dozens of other clients. Her victims included politicians, business leaders, and other wealthy individuals whose private therapy sessions had been recorded and used for blackmail. Collins lost her medical license permanently and faced multiple felony charges. But for Madison, the most important victory was the legal validation of Thomas Blackwood Sr.'s true will. With Margaret Ellis's evidence and the testimony of handwriting experts, federal investigators were able to prove conclusively that Jackson had forged the will filed after his father's death. Madison was officially recognized as the majority shareholder of Blackwood Industries, inheriting not just wealth, but the responsibility that came with controlling one of America's largest technology companies. Her first act as the new chairman of the board was to establish the Elena Rodriguez Foundation, dedicated to protecting whistleblowers and supporting the families of those who died exposing corporate corruption. The foundation was funded with $50 million from the Blackwood Industries treasury, ensuring that Elena's sacrifice would be remembered and that others would be encouraged to speak truth to power. Madison's second major decision was to promote Cameron Brooks to head of corporate security, a private sector role that would allow him to continue fighting corruption while remaining close to Madison and her growing family. Cameron accepted the position immediately, understanding that protecting Madison and her child was not just a professional responsibility, but a personal mission. The transformation of Blackwood Industries began immediately. Madison appointed Sarah Martinez, the former chief operating officer, who had been systematically undermined by Jackson's misogynistic leadership, as the new CEO. Together, they began implementing the ethical business practices that Thomas Sr. had envisioned for his company. "We have a choice," Madison told the assembled board of directors during her first official meeting as chairman. "We can continue to be a company that values profit over people, or we can become something better. We can be a company that our employees are proud to work for, that our customers trust, and that our communities benefit from having in their midst." The changes were sweeping and immediate. Employee compensation was restructured to include profit sharing and stock ownership, giving every worker a stake in the company's success. Executive salaries were capped at reasonable multiples of worker pay, ending the era of obscene compensation packages for senior management. Environmental and social responsibility became core components of every business decision. Madison also established a comprehensive ethics program with independent oversight and whistleblower protections that would prevent the kind of corruption that had flourished under Jackson's leadership. The program was administered by former FBI investigators and prosecutors, ensuring that any future criminal activity would be detected and reported immediately. 6 weeks after Jackson's arrest, Madison stood in the same boardroom where her nightmare had begun, but now she was the one at the head of the mahogany table. The board members who had enabled Jackson's crimes had been replaced with ethical leaders who shared Thomas Sr.'s vision of responsible corporate citizenship. Through the tall windows, Madison could see Manhattan stretching out below, millions of people living their lives, pursuing their dreams, facing challenges that she now understood were often rooted in the abuse of power by those who believed themselves untouchable. She thought about the universal struggles that bind all people together, the fight between right and wrong, the courage required to stand up to seemingly impossible odds, the determination needed to protect what matters most. As she addressed her new board about the company's future direction, Madison felt her baby kick strongly inside her, a reminder of why she had fought so hard and what she was building for the future. She had learned that real power doesn't come from domination, manipulation, or fear, but from integrity, compassion, and the willingness to stand up for what's right even when victory seems impossible. The old Blackwood Industries died with Jackson's arrest. Madison concluded her presentation to the board. "Today, we're not just rebuilding a company, we're creating a model for how business can be a force for good in the world. We're proving that profit and principles can coexist, that success doesn't require the destruction of others, and that true leadership means serving something greater than yourself." The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, coming from people who understood that they were witnessing not just the recovery of a company, but the birth of a new kind of corporate leadership. 3 months later, Madison gave birth to a healthy daughter whom she named Elena Thomas Blackwood. Elena for the friend who had died trying to expose the truth, and Thomas for the grandfather who had seen past Jackson's charm to recognize his fundamental corruption. Cameron was in the delivery room, having asked Madison to marry him just 2 weeks earlier, in a proposal that was both romantic and practical, ensuring that their family would be legally protected against any future threats. As Madison held her daughter for the first time, she thought about the legacy she was leaving for the next generation. Elena Thomas would grow up in a world where her mother had proven that even seemingly powerless people could triumph over corruption and cruelty. She would inherit not just wealth, but the knowledge that power comes with responsibility and that true success is measured not by what you accumulate, but by what you contribute to making the world better. Jackson Blackwood ultimately received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, spending his remaining years in a federal facility where his wealth and connections meant nothing. Victoria was sentenced to 25 years for her role in the conspiracy. Dr. Collins received 15 years and was required to pay restitution to all the patients whose privacy she had violated. But the most fitting justice was the transformation of Blackwood Industries itself. Under Madison's leadership, the company became a model of ethical business practices, worker empowerment, and social responsibility. The employees who had suffered under Jackson's tyrannical management now owned a significant portion of the company they had helped build. The community investments and environmental initiatives that Jackson had dismissed as wasteful spending became sources of pride and competitive advantage. In the end, Madison Carter Blackwood had not just survived Jackson's elaborate trap, she had transformed it into the very weapon that destroyed him and built something better from the ashes of his corrupt empire. Thomas Sr.'s faith in her had been justified. Elena's sacrifice had been redeemed, and a new generation would inherit a world where speaking truth to power was not just possible, but protected and rewarded. The fight was over. The real work of building a better future was just beginning. What did you think about Madison's incredible journey from powerless victim to corporate powerhouse? The way she turned Jackson's own weapons against him was absolutely brilliant, wasn't it? Stories like this remind us that even when the odds seem impossible, courage and intelligence can triumph over corruption and cruelty. If Madison's fight for justice inspired you, show some love by hitting that like button. It really helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one. Drop a comment below and tell us, what was the most shocking twist in Madison's story? Was it the therapy betrayal, the forged will, or something else entirely? We love hearing your thoughts. And hey, if you're hungry for more dramatic stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. We've got some absolutely mind-blowing tales coming up that you won't want to miss. Thanks for listening, and remember, sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one everyone underestimated. Until next time.